Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar here. My name is Brian Reed. I'm the Chief Mobility Officer here at NowSecure. I'll be one of your speakers and tour guides, along with my friend, Jason Michael Perry from Mindgrub. We'll get started in about 1.5 to 2 minutes. We always want to give people time to get logged in. If your life is like my life of endless Zooms all day long, you jump from meeting to meeting like I do, you appreciate the waiting of a minute or two. So we'll get started here in just a few seconds. Thank you. Welcome for those of you who are joining us now to our DevSecOps Bunch March edition. I'm joined today by Jason Michael Perry, a phenomenal guy from Mindgrub, CTO, storyteller, and expert in best practices, as well as secure application software delivery. And he's going to share stories with us today on our journey. As we typically do with these webinars, we wait about 1 to 2 minutes to make sure everybody can log in before we get going with the live session. So I will hold for a second. We encourage you to participate today. We do have open Q&A and chat capabilities. And like all webinars, everyone wants to be able to deliver the most value to you as part of the conversation. We started in about 30 seconds. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today. We're going to get rolling. This is the March DevSecOps Bunch. As many of you know, we're on a journey here through the year of a different topic, a different speaker, and a different friend. Today, I'm joined by Jason Michael Perry, the CTO of Mindgrub, and we're going to talk about integrating security into the software development lifecycle. As with all sessions, we're going to take advantage of all the features of the Zoom webinar environment. So we will be taking Q&A at the end. We encourage you to use the Q&A capability within Zoom. We will also have the chat open. So the chat will allow you to speak with each other, as well as our other moderators who will be monitoring the chat in case you kind of have questions or comments as we go along. We are recording today's session. We will, a few days after, provide a copy of the video and the slides for anyone who wants them for the attendees today. And I want to remind everybody that we have some fun giveaways at the tail end. So while you're at home, possibly, or at work, if you're lucky, watching today, you have a chance to win some stuff and answer some cool questions. So pay attention because the trivia questions are tied to the content today. And so without further ado, I'd like to ask Jason to introduce himself and to introduce Mindgrub. Jason?
Thanks. I'm Jason Michael Perry. I'm the CTO of Mindgrub, and I also like to say the man with 3 first names. I've been in this industry for 20 plus years. I hail from New Orleans, born and raised, but I'm now based in Baltimore. At Mindgrub, I oversee all of our engineering teams, which includes our web application development, mobile development, DevOps, IT and QA teams.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the guy with the woolly beard, otherwise known as Brian Reed. I've been on the mobile journey since BlackBerry almost 20 years ago. I am getting old. So at NowSecure, as the Chief Mobility Officer, I spend my time working with clients, customers in the industry on strategies and best practices, whether it's mobile digital transformation, all the way down to how to best design and test the security of your mobile applications. So I'm happy to be joined here with Jason. And we'll be sharing what we've learned on our collective journeys here. So a brief introduction for NowSecure, for those who don't know us. We were actually born over 10 years ago when the iPhone and the Android devices first came out, and our founder was really fascinated by all the mobile data being collected, harvested, and unprotected on those initial devices. And so He founded and wrote the original book on mobile forensics. And over the past 10 years, we've built a commercial business here with NowSecure on the mission to save the world from unsafe mobile apps. We work with organizations large and small. As you can see here, we'll tell some of their stories today. We're big believers in standards. So if you're not a member of or participating with and leveraging Oauth and some of the other resources available there, we encourage it. We'll have more links to that later, and lots of analyst firms like us too. And so with that, I'd like to invite Jason to tell us a bit about Mindgrub.
Sure. Mindgrub is a creative consultancy and a technical agency. We develop custom web applications, websites, mobile applications, as well as do marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 and smaller companies. This includes large utility companies such as Exelon or Entergy, as well as a lot of work in the government and consumer brand space, such as Under Armour or Wendy's. So if you're looking for custom application development, we're your folks.
And that, my folks, is going to give you the front end and the back end of the story today with Secure by Design and Trust but Verify. Now, as we frequently do in these webinars, we'd like to start with some polling to kind of understand the audience and sort of where you are in your own security journey. So Kelly, if you could open the first poll for us. And our first poll here, and we would ask everyone to answer, our first poll here is, do you practice Secure by Design? Do you know what it is? Do you practice it? So you have the obvious yes and no. You might be considering it. You might be actively planning it. You might be in pilot. For those of you who are not, Jason's going to tell you the story today of why it's such an important part of an overall set of best practices for any organization, building and deploying mobile or frankly web applications as well. And I think Jason brings a good storyline today because of his experience doing this for a lot of really impressive companies that he listed earlier. So we have a few more seconds before the poll is going to close. So I would encourage everyone to go ahead and make your choice. And I'm also watching the vote count. Come on, folks, we can get more of you voting. And so here we go. So I'm going to start talking to the results that I can see. And so actually 42%, almost half the folks said yes, which is great. Only 24% said no, which is also good, meaning the remainder are in process, and we strongly encourage you to go down that path. As I said, Jason's going to give us some tips and tricks down that here in a minute or two. So as I move to the next poll, we have a second poll, which is a broader base. As we think about security and security testing tools, what tools are you using, right? It typically takes a village in terms of both process and technology to deliver secure applications, be it mobile, web, or otherwise. And so we're interested to understand what your application security testing portfolio looks like, be it mobile or web. There are a wide variety of technologies you can apply. Many organizations will have many of these and even more, depending on what your risk profile looks like and what your tooling profile looks like as well. So we encourage everyone to vote. This is a multi-choice, so you should be able to select all that apply. And we'll leave the poll open for about another 5 or 10 seconds here. Get a few more folks to vote. And with that, I'll start talking about the results. So the winner, DAST, about 25% of you are using DAST, 21% are doing manual pen testing. It's a tie between static source scanning and API security testing. And sadly, only 8% of you are using SCA. And in fact, none of you are using IAST. Well, that's fairly interesting and fascinating. So the chat box is exploding in the background. I'm going to keep rolling here so that we can keep going. So I'm going to get us teed up here if we want to close the poll here. Whoops. There we go. I got the poll closed finally. And it's advancing. I apologize. So the one great thing to think about is, as Jason and I were setting up for the presentation, is this idea of the best way to deliver a mobile application or any web application securely is to practice both Secure by Design and Trust but Verify. So these are like two sides of the coin. How do I organize to go into the development process and run the development process? And how do I make sure that the security we have in mind is actually being delivered in a verifiable way through the process? So with that, I'll click to the next one for you, and the floor is yours, Jason. I will go on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So, it's interesting developing a lot of mobile applications for our clients. You know, it's very often that companies forget to look at the full application, the whole application. The mobile app is just a tiny piece of a large development process and includes typically a backend as well as network traffic to move information and data between whatever backend system you have to your mobile or your web application. Mobile apps are in a lot of ways akin to developing thin client applications, in the modern day. And so what we find is that when we're having conversations or talking about mobile application development and design process, that sometimes, we're not looking at this as a holistic application and looking at all the different components that are necessary for this entire process to work from a security standpoint. So to break it down, we really want to look at each component and the importance of these components and how we approach the development lifecycle in developing our applications. One of the number one pieces, which actually makes our job a lot easier, is the physical device and the operating system, be it iOS or Android in the mobile application development. There's a ton that the OS does already for us to try and really focus you on what you need to do to make your application more secure. There's the mobile app itself, the source code that you write, the choices that you make, the decisions that you make in developing the application to make sure that you're writing code in a secure way that meets different guidelines such as Oauth, but also understanding, what things make it into the source code. One of the key things that a lot of folks forget about is the network traffic, the data going back and forth. When we look at different types of attacks or approaches that may be used, man in the middle is one of the most common ways to try and access data within a mobile application or get access to PII, personally identifiable information. So understanding your design approach and how it impacts the network, but also the data that's moving across that network, be it data in transit, but also the data that you will have at rest. And so we want to keep all of these things in mind as we look at each of these individual components and the approach that they have on our app. So the first one I want to jump to is the operating system itself. iOS does a ton to try and make sure that our applications are sandboxed and protected and run in a way that limits the ability for your application to communicate with other applications. The idea here is that by providing the sandbox, if for any reason your application itself were to be compromised based on decisions that you make in development, that is limited to only your application, and that's something that's going to spread across the other apps. The only exception to those rules are generally when a phone has been jailbroken, which may remove some of the inherent security restrictions that are built directly into the operating system. Some of the other things that iOS provides, in addition to a lot of these, which are really around isolating the application during runtime, is also what's referred to as a secure enclave. Most modern iPhones use either Touch ID, Face ID, or some form of recognition to unlock an application or unlock your phone. And when you use that, it releases access to an element of hardware that's built into the physical phone that will allow only your application access to a certain data store. And that data store is referred to as a secure enclave, which is an encrypted storage for information. This is a place where you can store PII, secure data, or certain information if you need to, and make sure that that info is only available to your application once the person is authenticated using one of those aspects of the device. And because it's stored on hardware, there isn't a way to easily, at least that we know of, to get access to whatever data store is used there. It's a perfect place to put things such as tokens, passwords, or other crucial information. Android also has a series of different systems in place that mimic a lot of the things that are built in by iOS into their operating system. I would say that Android is not as secure, and it's not that Google hasn't taken the same considerations into play from a design or development standpoint. It's just that the number of hardware manufacturers mean that the amount, what your device may physically have may depend on the type of device that you own. What a Pixel may do compared to a Samsung phone, it could just be greatly different from a encryption and security standpoint. One of the big things is the hardware-backed encryption that's used to do something similar to the secure enclave. Whereas iOS devices, from a hardware and a software standpoint, it's built in. Every iPhone automatically includes the functionality of the secure enclave. It's up to the manufacturers to decide if they want to provide that same hardware level encryption. And it's a decision that some of the more budget, distributors and developers of hardware have decided not to implement. In those cases, Google does provide a software implementation, but at the same time, that software implementation is not as it's not as good as the hardware implementation on the operating system level. So in saying that, while the operating system does a lot, from a development standpoint, we have to keep in mind that the OS by itself is not everything that we need. A lot of the common ways that mobile applications are taken advantage of are by insecure data storage, transferring secure information without using HTTPS, even though HTTPS now on the Apple is required for any app that's been released since 2017. Looking at sessions and how session storage and tokens are actually used, or things such as certificate pinning and the way that data is sent over a network, so transport vulnerabilities. So those are some of the core ways that that a user information may be compromised using a mobile application. Some other things that are worth keeping in mind are hidden screen display and multitasking. For an application such as a banking app, if you have your account information up, and you were to give your phone to a fellow user to take a look at an image or a picture, if they were to use the multitasking feature, it's possible that they may be able to take screenshots or see an application in use that's displaying certain PII information. So that's something that the OS is not going to limit, that you may want to keep in mind for your application. Certificate pinning is the idea of limiting who has access to your application's backend. For a lot of our utility clients, for example, we develop an application that gives you the ability to hit a publicly accessible API and grab data such as energy usage or payment information. Having the information public means that someone could potentially monitor network traffic and then try and mimic those calls to do unexpected things. Certificate pinning allows us to maintain a key within the application that says only this app can get access to that particular backend, and can limit the access of those APIs to make sure that those calls can only be made privately to those who have that preferred access. Third-party keyboards are now available in both iOS as well as Android, and the limitations on what information is being used there, can really depend. So if we take a look at a third-party keyboard, you may be familiar with more recently applications copying data or accessing the clipboard just to see what information was available, possibly a password or other things that you've grabbed, and taking that data and using it in whatever ways that you may not be aware of. We talked about the secure enclave, but especially on a jailbroken device, data that's stored as plain text. It was several years ago now, but the Starbucks mobile app was determined to store a lot of its information as plain text. And once someone was able to get access to that sandbox environment on a mobile device, it was really easy to get access to tons of information about that customer. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at places where we should encrypt data, even if we're storing it within that sandbox environment. Again, the phone does a lot to protect us, but at the same time, a jailbroken device, could provide certain levels of information that are unexpected. That leads into the lack of encryption. Encryption should happen both in flight over HTTPS, as well as when it's at rest, be it on your server in a backend, or if it's identifiable information that's being stored locally on the physical device. And then the last thing that we really want to think about in terms of the OS is considering the transport vulnerabilities. I mentioned man-in-the-middle attacks, which is one of the more common attacks to use. If you're at a Starbucks or at a location that has a publicly accessible Wi-Fi network, even over HTTPS, your data is still being transmitted over a public network. That can mean that certain information, especially metadata about the types of calls that you're using, are accessible to other people on the network, that are potentially looking at the information that's passing back and forth. So we want to keep in mind that that is a possibility and understand what we're doing and what things we're putting in place to make sure that as data is being transmitted, that we're not providing information access or vulnerability, unexpected vulnerabilities. One that I did leave off here that I wanted to make sure that I also listed, debugging and logs. Possibly one of the easiest ways to get a good feel for what's going on within an application is to plug it in and get access to the logs. If a user is running Xcode or Android Studio, it's relatively easy to plug in a phone or connect a phone to one of those IDEs and get access to the logging data that may include a lot of unexpected information that's being put out there for the sake of debugging. I think web as well as mobile, one of the number one things that a lot of hackers may look at is just trying to break the application to cause unexpected errors to see how the application responds and use that dump of data as a way to find vulnerabilities within your application. Now, how you approach this is going to greatly depend on the risks that are associated with your application. Now, I'm taking a stab and kind of just looking at 3 different levels of application risk, which I'm going to say is high, medium, and low. A high risk application is an application that most likely has high permission needs. This means that you're accessing physical pieces of the device or asking the device for access to, to information that a user may consider fairly private. That's their location. That's potentially access to Bluetooth or to the speaker or other mechanisms of the device, the clipboard, or to their contacts, pictures, images, assets. So by extension, getting that access to that information on a user's phone means that you now also have to make sure that you're putting the right restrictions in place to make sure that that data is not being used in an unexpected way. A second piece for something that is a high risk application is the level of PII, personally identifiable information, that you're going to have access to with an application. So a banking app that has access to your spending history, your account numbers and information, as well as your home address and other information would be a very high risk application. But an app that has access to your phone number, maybe your first name and last name, that's not necessarily as high risk. And you can potentially be a little less cautious about the steps that you're doing from a development standpoint, depending on the level of PII that your application is handling. So in the example, kind of looking to the bubbles on the right, if your application is being used for healthcare data, such as, making it potentially subject to HIPAA laws and rules, you're going to want to take a different approach to the level of security restrictions that you put in place for your application. A medium level access app is one that has mid to low PII information access. So we're talking about maybe your address, phone number, email address, name, things that most likely we can find on the internet or other sources. And it has internet access. So this is something that you're going to want to make sure that you're putting, that you're still designing in a secure way, but we're not necessarily worried about hiding the screen during multitasking and hitting some of the same levels that we would in a high risk application. A low risk application ideally has low or no PII, and also ideally is a standalone mobile application. Think, for example, a game that has either very limited or no need to connect to a cellular network or the internet. And so by design, that limitation, that limited access of data means that that application can run, do whatever it needs without compromising information in the majority of cases. During our development process, some of the ways that we can make sure, be it a high, medium, or low level, that we're putting the things in place that we need are listed here on the right side based on the Oauth checklist. So a lot of these are keeping in mind that some of the things that the OS can't protect us from, such as looking at our input validation and making sure the data that users are entering is clean before being passed on to applications to avoid things, to avoid different forms of attacks. We want to make sure that when we're displaying data that we're properly escaping characters. We want to look at authentication. Session use tokens of authentication is obviously extremely important. A lot of applications will use a token that has a designated lifetime, be it months or weeks, that allows your application to continue via session management to get access to a backend. So looking at how you manage that token structure, the length of time that token is available, and also the types of checks that you have in place to renew those tokens are extremely important. I think a lot of modern backends have taken the approach of giving every device its own unique token as opposed to sharing tokens across devices. That also allows you to revoke, say, an iPhone while allowing an Android tablet to still maintain session access. Encryption and storage, I've also talked about logging, or a core to the approaches that you take around your application development, and are an essential piece to making sure that your apps are indeed secure. It's okay, you can go ahead, Brian.
Sorry, I was preparing to unmute myself when I advanced the slide. I apologize for that. Didn't want to have my background noise get in your way there. So, okay, let's go backwards. There we go. So we've talked about a secure by design strategy, which really starts with a foundation of understanding how the operating system works and the APIs work. iOS and Android very clearly are different, you know, in the way that Jason has described them. And those are all appreciation that developers need to have, not just security teams. And so, you know, now we have developers with the right frame of reference. Okay, I need to understand how the operating systems work and the APIs work and the differences on those. Now we have a better understanding of where risk points are, where the threats might be, and potential areas to focus on or places to avoid, right? And an approach that we can take for having a more secure application from an architecture and development approach. We're building it. What happens as we build it? And how do we get it out the door? And how do we know that the applications themselves are secure upon delivery? And so trust but verify is something we've been talking about on and off for the last 2 years as organizations kind of move into this more rapid cycle. And so I'm going to kind of begin with the end in mind, which is kind of 5 principles of trust but verify are: build security testing into the pipeline. Late stage testing is not security. Security is security throughout the development lifecycle. Practice incrementalism, right? For the code you write every day, you should test it every day, right? Waiting till the end. If you write 1,000 lines of code a day and you wait 100 days, that's bad. If you write 1,000 lines of code a day and you test 1,000 lines of code a day, that's good. Shift to an always-on automation. You know, there's a famous CISO has been around. A lot of organizations run digital transformation projects. His name's Jim Ruth. And Jim's view of the world is some continuous testing at a common bar or level every day of everything you do is better than perfect testing. So deploying always-on security testing automation is a key part of this. Automate as much as you can, as frequently as you can, and then you can do the manual things that maybe require human ingenuity on a periodic basis. Now, as part of the cycle, it's not about finding vulnerabilities, it's about delivering high-quality software. So providing fast feedback loops to developers when issues are found, and having that feedback include evidence and repair remediation instructions and code examples is how you fix it, right? So because we want it fixed because we want it secure at release time. And then the classic thing you do in any continuous improvement model is tune and improve, right? So Uber, for example, one of our customers, didn't get to code commit to prod in 90 minutes by dancing. And they also didn't get there overnight. They got there by practices that Jason and I are talking about. And those are the kinds of things we're sharing with you. So let's talk about kind of a typical software pipeline, right? And you have one of these diagrams in your organization, and there's a variety of ways to do them. I'll use kind of this linear box, right? So you have this daily or weekly rinse and repeat, depending on how your sprint cycles work. And then you move things through this pipeline and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. And then at some point you move into staging and prod. And then there's this mega feedback loop. That's what's going on in prod and the market feedback and everything else that will drive your innovation. So we'll use this kind of as like a framework to talk about, well, how do we build security testing into the pipeline, right? And this goes back to one of the questions we asked earlier. That's it takes a village, right? So in your organization, one or more of your teams, or in different organizations, looking at security in many different places. You may have some AppSec training. You may actually have security requirements as part of writing any application. You may be doing SCA repo scans or static, or you have IDE plugins, and maybe you're all the way down to manual pen testing and outsourced pen testing that happens less frequently on the tail end for those really high-risk applications. And so within all of this is a list of many of the most common things we see best-in-class organizations doing is they're using these different tools. And you can find in lots of survey data and other best practices research that it is about security testing and security analysis and security enablement at every single point along the line, from the developer all the way through the cycle. Now, what we have found in looking at mobile more specifically is there's some patterns that cause real pain. So static source code creates a high degree of false positives, which frustrates everybody, slows down the machine, gums up the works. I was talking to a customer last week, a new customer. They had hired 2 humans just to work their way through the output of their static tools to figure out which ones were actually valid to fix. And that's certainly not where security and development become friends from that scenario. In our analysis of millions of apps, what we found is that static source code testing generally finds only about 20% of all of the actual most common vulnerabilities. Jason talked about a lot of them. Man-in-the-middle attacks, improper cert pinning, data leakage on device, data leakage over the air. They're out there in spades a lot. And so we want to try to help people minimize that, right? And while static source code testing provides a lot of value in a number of key areas, it doesn't do it. It's hard to automate things, very hard. The number of people we talked to who said, I didn't even know you could automate security testing for mobile is very high, because what we've learned, our ingrained learning is, no, it's manual and it's hard and it takes 2 weeks and so on and so forth. So because of what's in this rinse and repeat box, what we find is a very high rate of security bugs escape. So we've been benchmarking Apple and Google app stores for years, and the needle never moves. If you look at industry benchmarks, you'll find cross-site scripting never goes away. Cross-site scripting for many organizations is the #1 vulnerability on web. In mobile, we find that 85% of all apps we test, no matter where they come from, have security vulnerabilities. Some are worse, some are better. But 85% have security vulnerabilities, and that's a bad thing. And 70% leak PII that could violate GDPR, CCPA, or other privacy rules and regulations. To compound that, less than 10% of organizations have any kind of automated security testing that works effectively for a high degree of their risk coverage. And so we have this sort of challenge of we are now designing things more securely. How do we verify the security in a way that meets the need and the speed of the pipelines that we need to have? And so today there are technologies and best practices that enable you to integrate security testing directly into the pipeline. Very specifically, it tests the mobile binary at or after build time. So by building the mobile binary and then installing and running it on a real device, now you have the ability to actually see what happens from the perspective of an attacker's ability to exploit vulnerabilities in your app. Jason talked earlier about, is your app properly working with the secure enclave? Are you properly storing keys and managing cryptographic material? Is your sensitive data leaking onto an SD card in an unencrypted fashion? And so on and so forth, right? So there's an ability now to actually plug this autonomous running security in the background and have it test each day, each build of an app on a mobile device, so you get that true experience of the app that's connected to the backend APIs and the behavior of the app within the device environment. And so in doing that, then you want to apply standards. So we're big believers in Oauth. We love to support it. Our people participate in evolving the specs, and so leverage and look at the OWASP MASVS and other standards like NIAP for federal as a mechanism to choose what your security testing checklist ought to look like and how to build a good threat model for your mobile applications. And so what winds up happening when you turn on this autonomous and security, this is not about replacing a pen test. This is about deploying software that runs hundreds of tests in the background on the applications as you build them, that allows you to identify the most common vulnerabilities found in production apps in the App Store and close those gaps, wind those gaps down. And so what that allows an organization to do is, through that automation now, because you're catching all the low-hanging fruit, you move faster, right? Instead of waiting for a 2-week pen test at the end to test 100% of the app, you've got automated testing that's covering 80, 90% of the app, and then a little bit of pen testing manual at the end for the really complicated stuff, or for super high risk tier 1 type of applications, and so on and so forth. So these super fast feedback loops now give you faster performance. They give you faster mean time to repair, because the feedback being provided to the developer and the ticketing systems they use is, here's a new security bug, and here's how to fix it, with some sample code and the evidence of exactly where, or pinpointing where, those issues occur, right? If you give them all that detail and no false positives, boom, they can fix it a lot faster. So your close rate goes up, your mean time to repair compresses. When you then do that and you set a bar that says, we're not going to release with anything that's medium or high, or some sort of density of security permissions, then your defect escape rate goes down as well. Now you're finding more, they're not getting their way out into the public, and obviously you're deliver a higher quality software at scale in an automated fashion for your organizations. So there's a great strategy here now where I use my Secure by Design, which is I'm building the app and understanding the overall app architecture from a security perspective within the device and the network infrastructure I'm running, and then I'm automatically testing it throughout that lifecycle. So we can bring Secure by Design and Trust But Verify together and start thinking about, how does this really accelerate the velocity? In this strategy now, you've got security built into the mind of the developer, not just into the tool chain and infrastructure that you're running. And that drives efficiencies in the organization, that drives efficiencies in delivery. You're enabling continuous testing through that cycle, and all of these things will ultimately drive scale and velocity through an organization. And so that's how you get companies like some of the organizations we have that have hundreds of app pipelines running at a pretty high rapid rate with automation built in. And they have to do that because they don't have enough humans to do the work. And with the developers effectively trained and understanding about where the risk areas are in secure coding best practices, and then the automation in the background verifying the code they write, that's how you get the velocity within your pipeline. And so with that, Jason, as we kind of pull this all together, like what are your 3 key takeaways, and how do you talk about this with your clients in terms of Secure by Design?
I think the number one thing, which I know we've both hit on, is that while Apple and Google do a ton to make sure that the inherent operating systems, iOS and Android, are secure, by themselves, they can't prevent all of the different vectors for attacks. And so we have to understand the limitations and the places that, as developers, we need to fill in for those gaps, or understand that they're just aspects of an application that they can't prevent alone. We also have to keep in mind the level of risk that we're willing to take, depending on the type of application that we're building. If you're building a tour guide app for a aquarium, the level of risk and the level of access to secure data and PII is just going to be limited. It's not as important that you take that you go to the extent that you would expect a bank or a utility or a certain or an investment company to take with an application. So you need to assess what type of data you have access to, what type of information is flowing through your application, and potentially through your network, and use that information to determine what rules are in place. I know that we've talked about some of the guidelines, such as Oauth, and if you were to hit every single checkbox on the Oauth list, for certain applications, it may be overkill. So understanding what's important for you and your particular needs. And then the last thing is establishing a software development lifecycle that makes the most sense, that puts checks and balances in place to make sure that you're building an application that is secure by design. That means, potentially having linters and things in place to test for code smell, making sure that you're not hard coding, data, especially credentials in your application and your source code. That also means, taking consideration on who has access to your public and private APIs, and how data is being, transmitted, as well as stored within your application.
And so we bring the Trust But Verify together as very much one of the partnership that occurs between development and security teams, right? They need to have a common understanding of risks, threats, and overall security knowledge, right? And that doesn't mean a developer needs to become a security pen tester. It means a developer needs to understand the implications of how to write secure code in the first place, and what the operating systems are doing for them and what they're not. Then you need to establish a tiered security policy and agreements between the two. And this policy level is important because what you're basically doing is defining a common bridge across security and development teams of what is a security standard, what matters from a security perspective, what areas are of highest concern that developers should pay attention to, and so on and so forth, right? Having that policy and a set of operational agreements around it streamlines the overall performance. One of our clients that we were talking to a couple of weeks ago was talking about how different security teams within their large global multinational behave differently with different development teams. And the development teams felt like it was a game of whack-a-mole because depending on which security team tested their app, they got different answers back because there wasn't a consistent policy. Don't forget the policy and the agreements across the organizations was a lesson learned from this very well-known global multinational you would know. Continuously security test every build every day. There's things you do in life every day. It is now possible to deploy automated continuous security testing. You can tune it to meet different security bars, but the fact that it can do so much of the work for you really helps you build that into the process. And then while I'm sitting here talking about automation, we know there are tier one super high risk applications. The kinds of companies that Jason and I have talked about, you can't automate everything. You still need the human ingenuity piece. So make sure your risk management program and your security program has the place for the proper expert pen test, whether delivered internally or from an outside expert, to protect those crown jewels. We talked about power companies. We talked about purchasing things. We talked about energy infrastructure, right? Those kinds of things. Make sure you get a pen test too on top of the security automation. So we're going to be moving into Q&A and so forth here in a minute. So I'll remind people, please use the Q&A tab in your Zoom webinar environment. Wanted to share a story or two with you, and I think Caribou Coffee is kind of a nice example. So Caribou Coffee, if you kind of think about what's happened in the last couple of years with the pandemic plus business in general, you have Starbucks, who's a competitor that's very mobile enabled. There's a lot of purchasing that goes on there. You also have the pandemic, which suddenly converted everything from pick up a coffee, drink a cup of coffee, hanging out in the corner of the store to drive up and pick it up and drive away. And so Caribou Coffee realized that they needed to improve their mobile application and really making it a top tier remote experience and moving the bulk of their transactions and customer experience from in-store to in-app. Now, in that journey, as they started adding features, they realized there was a lot of friction in their pipe. And so they had a reasonably secure process in place, but they took a step up, solidified their security best practices, and brought in automated testing with NowSecure. In about 1 quarter, this is how fast they got value, about 1 quarter's time, about 4 months, they were able to move from a quarterly release frequency to a monthly release frequency. They were releasing then on a monthly basis, not only with higher quality software with fewer escape defects, they actually were delivering features a lot faster because the market needed a faster release cycle because of these changes during the pandemic. And so there's a nice crawl, walk, run here. And the strategies that Jason and I are talking about can have pretty significant impact pretty quickly if you're modeling correctly and understanding, and then you're applying the appropriate testing techniques and automation in your pipeline. So with that, we both have some resources for you. So I'll share a couple here. So if you want to learn, if you're on the developer side and you want a really good intro to mobile security, there's a free CyberA course that one of our trainers put together, Pentester trainers, and that's up on CyberA. You can just sign up for it in the public domain and run it for free. We have a variety of other resources. If you're a DevOps person building your tool chain, have a look at that. If you're a developer, we have a 120-page best practices guide on all the APIs and OS stuff you should look at. We also have what are the 5 most common vulnerabilities found in millions of apps in the App Store, which is a great place to go look and make sure you don't have those problems within your application. If you're big into DevSecOps, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Every 2 weeks in your inbox, you'll get a laundry list of best practices you can leverage in Dev, in Sec, and Ops, as well as keep up to date with the activities we have going on at NowSecure. So with that, Jason, you have some resources as well from Mindgrub. Pass it back to you.
Yes, so we actually developed with NowSecure a white paper on best practices around mobile app security. So that's a great place to start. But in addition to that, we commonly blog around mobile enterprise development and security on a regular basis on the Mindgrub website. So feel free to check out the Mindgrub blog, but also subscribe to our newsletter so you can get access to new information, new white papers, and other data as we release it.
Good stuff. All right, so time for some fun here. We are going to move into a giveaway. So one of the things we've done with DevSecOps Bunch is every month we give away stuff. So today, each of Mindgrub and NowSecure have boxes full of stuff. Now in the stuff is branded goodies. So you get stuff like water bottles and Yeti cups and t-shirts and hats and stickers and all the great things you need in life. So I have two questions I'm going to ask. The first question will be on behalf of Mindgrub. I'm going to ask the question, and then you have the chance to win it by answering in the chat box. So get your chat box open and ready. And the first 3 people to answer the following question correctly will win the Mindgrub box of goodies. And then after that, we will ask the second question. So the Mindgrub question we have for today is, as an application developer, what's most important to know about the security of operating systems? As an application developer, what's the most important thing to remember or know about the security of operating systems? Okay. We have 1 so far. 2 so far. There you go. All right. So the answer is anything related to the OS is not enough, right? So we have variations of that. If we scroll back up, I believe I saw the its weaknesses, which is, or Robert, where we go, are they here? Robert was our first winner, Robert Hines. Michael is the second winner. And let's see, Michael answered twice, so I'm going further down. And John V. Kelly is the third winner. Got it, Kelly? All righty. I'm going to move on to the second question. What percentage of mobile apps in the public app stores have security vulnerabilities in them? And we had a couple of 85% in there really fast. It is a shocking number. I was just talking with a congressional subcommittee, myself and our founder a few weeks ago, and we showed them this big analysis of millions of apps, and they were pretty surprised too. So that is the reality, I'm sorry to say, but I think any of us who are in the security world know, yeah, there's lots of little vulnerabilities running around in lots of places. So our goal is to help you. So those winners, for each of the winners, you'll be getting big boxes in the next week or two shipped out to you. Thank you again for participating today and playing our game. So I'm going to open up Q&A here. I'm going to find my way over to the Q&A panel. And I will go ahead and moderate those and either pass them to you or pass them to me.
And I will say that I think I might have answered 2 or 3. And if you want me to just...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Repeat the question and then state the answer.
So the first question that was noted is, how can your application be vulnerable through multitasking screens? Also, is your data visible in HTTPS calls? So the first part of that is that during multitasking on default, both on iOS and Android, it essentially takes a image snapshot of your application in its current state and uses that to represent the application as you move between displays. You can still take a screenshot in when you're in the multitasking mode. So what that means is that a banking app, or an investment app may by accident have information such as your account number, your account balance, or other data that is PII that could be accessible if you were sharing a screen. The most common example is, showing someone a photo on your phone and that person deciding that they're gonna take the luxury of, multitasking to see what else you're running on your app and potentially being able to get, a quick view of certain data and credentials. The second part of that around HTTPS is that while the actual body of the message itself is encrypted, there is a ton of metadata, including the URL that's being called itself and potentially any information that's part of a get URL sequence that would come after the question mark. So it's possible that your call potentially has a token in the URL or a session ID or other information. Worst case is it at least gives a bad player information on the public URLs that they could potentially access or call, that they could attempt to use to spoof those types of requests and generate error messages that may allow them to determine what types of URLs and arguments that they need to pass to the application. So it can be, honestly, one of the biggest vulnerabilities is to assume that HTTPS by itself means that everything is good. And that is by no means the case. The most common approach, the most common weakness with your mobile application is without question the transportation layer, and just being able to see the URL calls that are being made and use that to reverse engineer calls towards your application's backend.
So looking over here, the QA window keeps disappearing on me. So I'm going to ask you some of the questions that I saw that were coming through as well. Building on what you just said, one of the things that I'll share as an answer and then steer the follow-on question that fits in the flow is one of the things we were requested to test and we're actually able to do is in our automated testing, we actually crack open the TLS tunnel and show you what's inside. And by doing that, we're able to show you what an attacker can see. And that allows you to then understand, oh, okay, yes, I'm using HTTPS SSL, but more things can still be seen. I need to escalate to a higher level of security capabilities. So one of the questions in here is what measures to secure data during transport are best measures? Jason, where would you go with that? CERT pinning or other things?
Yeah, CERT pinning is definitely, CERT pinning is, I think, these days an essential way to make sure that your application has permission to talk to your backend. It's essentially like the key to the lock. And I'll tell you that CERT pinning is a pain. It's a for lack of a better way, it's a PETA. You know what that stands for. And that you do need to update your application to make sure that the key within the app is up to date. So it does mean regularly updating your application in the app stores, but that key will ensure that only something with that key can make calls to that API layer. And that limit itself can prevent someone from just knocking at the door or randomly making attempts to see what types of responses may come back from your API calls. So that level of protection is, I think, an essential way to start. Unless you're comfortable with the idea that all of the APIs that your application's using are publicly accessible potentially to someone who's taking a look at the traffic that's going back and forth.
Got it. Okay, so now related to that, we might as well go down the other path, which is let's talk about securing data at rest. So what's your advice on best practices there? I'll share a little bit that in our testing, we find things like unencrypted data stored in log files, right? Be careful what you write to logs. Don't put PII in logs. Yes. We also find that there's a lot of use on the Android side of the house of the SD card, and without a thought to being careful about what is stored on the SD card in the first place, and then making sure that's properly encrypted and protected as well. So what are best practices for securing the data at rest side of the house?
Yeah, I will 100% agree with the things that you said. I mean, never, ever store data that has, some level of confidentiality or a high level of PII as plain text. I mean, that's the number one thing. You want to avoid that. And, again, you use the example of the SD card, Brian, but a jailbroken device or, a device that has malware or other, mechanisms on it, it's potentially possible for you to get access to that sandbox that application is running in. And that could give you access to all types of data or information if it's stored on this plain text. So encrypt, where it makes sense. Also, it's important to not only think about just encrypting, that information that's critical data, but also to think about how you're handling caching. If you have application displays and screens that you're caching as part of your application, it may be important to also look at what data and how long you keep that data on the device, especially if this is stored as text. Just a side note, one of the most common things with plain text credentials is if your application is being backed up to the App Store or iCloud or some other source, where the level of encryption that's being used is not necessarily the same as it running physically on your device. And that's one of the places where you can, easily get access to some of that plain text data. It's one of the first places to hit. If you are encrypting, especially if you're using a hash, make sure you look at hashes with salt. Especially if you have ideally not, but a hash, the information for the hash being stored, as part of your source code.
Got it. Digging back into a couple of the other questions here. So it's a question about, does NowSecure test mobile binaries in an automated way? Yes, we do. So we basically have an engine that drives the app on a physical device without a human. There's also this really cool rig, so we can like touch the screen and the buttons on the side too. So, so we do an automated testing pass. In the background, we actually do 4 passes through the application, testing a variety of different things, including testing things like cert pinning from that perspective. So yes, we can do that. And then there's another question about, actually, this is interesting, Jason. So do you consider the data kept in the iOS keychain as secure?
I do consider it kept secure, be it the Mac itself, be it the iPhone, be it the iPad. Access to that still requires a secure enclave and is still securely stored. So I think it's a great way to store information. It's also on the iOS side becoming a really easy way to store passwords and other data, because it's part of their recommended strong passwords that they now use as part of Safari, as well as in applications. So definitely a secure place to store information.
Absolutely. Let's see, digging through these, I think I'm going all the way back to the front. How do you prioritize open source vulns versus everything else?
I would say that NowSecure's ability to do static code analyzing is really helpful in that way. There's an aspect of working with application dependencies, be it things like, Google Analytics or a Firebase that you're probably going to have that are, binaries that you're adding to your application, some open source, some not, that it's helpful to know that there is something that's analyzing and giving you a rating based on that application code that you're dependent on. Outside of doing your research and feeling confident with, the organizations that you're including, code that you're including in your applications, I would say one of the big things is, be it CocoaPods or whatever source that you're using to include those dependencies, making sure that you update often.
Absolutely. Yeah, we tell you a horror story. So there's an SDK made by a Chinese marketing company, very popular in a lot of games and social media apps. Now, that SDK was fine for years, kind of sitting there. And then suddenly last fall, it turned into malicious data harvesting. So what they were actually doing was 2 bad things. The first one was they were scraping everything they could get out of the device, the user in the app, and profiling it. The second thing they were doing is they were actually hijacking advertising dollars. So if you were building an app and you were using third-party advertising library to monetize your app, maybe your app's free, but you make money on ads, they were actually lifting the transaction and catching the money out of that too, which is pretty wild. So, open source in mobile is the same as everywhere else, which is be careful what you trust, update often and frequently, verify the vendor, and continuously test it, because as we've seen, just because it was good yesterday doesn't mean tomorrow's build of the open source is safe as well. So with that, we're right up at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wind us down here. I would very much like to thank all of you for joining and participating with us today. Really great questions. We hope you got a lot of value out of the content. I'll reiterate that we will be sharing the video recording and the slides with everyone in a couple of days. Also, the prize winners, you'll be hearing from Kelly to get the logistics to send those goodies to you. I would very much like to thank Jason for joining us. Full of insight today. Jason, I'll pass it to you to say your final thoughts.
I really appreciate it. It was great having the opportunity to share, and thank you for having me be part of this.
There you go. So if you're looking to build mobile apps, give Jason's company a call at Mindgrub. They build really great apps for really great companies. Give us a call for your application security testing. We'll help make sure it's verified and you're ready for the real world. Have a good day, everybody. We will see you next month for our next DevSecOps Bunch. Goodbye now.